A man and his family ventured far into the Canadian Arctic in the dead of winter, 1870, in search of game. But come April, just the man came back. We initiated a search for the man's camp because the story he later told did not seem plausible. The eventual discovery of his camp would rank among the most horrific events in Canadian history, to the point that it verged on becoming legendary. If you're skeptical, this story's beginning won't be fun. But believe me, if you persist, things will eventually change for the better. Please use caution when watching. These are some of the most upsetting occurrences that the channel has ever reported, even though they are brief and not described in any detail. Legend has it that somewhere in the Canadian Arctic, far away from any human or animal settlement, hides a shadow, blacker than night. Cree and Algonquin youngsters would hear tales of the shadow from their elders around campfires as a warning about the dangers of giving into baser emotions like greed, despair, or starvation. Through the centuries, people passed down the legends with a blend of trepidation and respect for the supernatural being they portrayed. This specter was more than just a monster. It was known as the Wendigo. It was more akin to a wraith that preyed on the naivety of the human spirit. Legends describe the tall, gaunt creature with dark skin stretched taut over jutting bones. As for the Wendigo's feet, legend has it that they were nearly a yard long, had just one toe, and monstrous fingers that ended in claws capable of ripping a man's intestines out with a single swipe. Legend has it that even the most courageous hunters were scared off by its thunderous, boomy voice. The Wendigo was defined by its ravenous appetite, not its outward form. Its supposedly insatiable appetite for human flesh led it to commit atrocities so horrible that they bordered on the supernatural. Legend tells us that those who dare to confront it faced more than just a predator, a power that preys on humanity's frailty. There are three main ways that Cree and Algonquin people talk about the Wendigo. In the first, we have a monstrosity with superhuman abilities. Its origins are murky. In the second, the spirit of a Wendigo consumes the creature's soul, compelling it to commit heinous deeds. Finally, some people believe that the Wendigo is a cultural syndrome, a disorder that causes its victims to have an unhealthy obsession with human flesh. Each of these readings further illuminates the complexity and terror embodied by the legend. But ultimately, it's all just fiction, isn't it? Swift Runner was a revered and feared Cree man in the late 1800s. His towering stature of 6 feet, 3 inches, made him an intimidating hunter, and he formally exemplified the courage and ingenuity needed to survive on the harsh Canadian frontier. Swift Runner's early life is shrouded in obscurity, but by the 1870s, he had become famous as the head of a tiny Plains Cree clan that subsisted on the land's bounty and sold furs for necessities like wheat, tea, and rifles at Fort Edmonton. And Swift Runner's renown reached far beyond his own people as well. In 1875, merchants from the Hudson's Bay Company were so taken with his wit and dependability that they suggested he be appointed a reliable guide to the Northwest Mounted Police. For a while, it appeared as though Swift Runner's leadership and abilities could unite the Cree with the conquering settlers. Then, beneath this alluring surface, there was a shadowy side. Trade had introduced Swift Runner, like many others in the area, to alcohol, which had a devastating effect on him. He had developed a preference for whiskey in particular, and whenever that alcoholic beverage touched his lips, a transformation would occur. Swift Runner, when sober, was an impressively competent and charming man, but when intoxicated, he transformed into a monster. Rumors of his violent tantrums spread, and his formerly esteemed reputation became one of dread. His brief stint as a mounted police scout ended in shame, and his decline continued. Swift Runner's life story intersected with the Cree myth of the Wendigo, a specter that could infiltrate the lives of the oppressed and morally tainted. Swift Runner had first encountered this shadowy figure many years before, on a hunting expedition with a boy in the heart of the forest. Swift Runner ate the boy's corpse when they were both starving to death. This inconceivable deed made Swift Runner seem susceptible to the Wendigo's captivity, according to some. Swift Runner's decline had accelerated by 1878, and as his drinking worsened, his violent tendencies grew more pronounced, as did the whispers of the Wendigo's influence that followed him. Yet, regardless of whether the monster was real, or a manifestation of his guilt and despair, The shadow of this legendary being hung over him from that moment on. The events of that winter were all the more shocking because, despite these foreboding signs, half the time he was still a man of tremendous ability. And it was in the midst of this contradiction that Swift Runner and his family set out on a hunting expedition into the Sturgeon River country, as the season's cold winds swept across the northern wilderness late that year. The Cree had depended on these journeys for sustenance during the harsh winter months for generations. Swift Runner took his wife, Charlotte, and their 6 children, along with his brother and mother, into the forest in the hopes of returning with piles of meat and fur. It was a familiar ritual, and it should have guaranteed their survival. But this winter was particularly brutal. Day after day, they explored the snow-covered terrain in search of sustenance, but their efforts were fruitless. Game became scarcer, and the family's traps caught hardly anything. Hunger soon started to chew at them, and desperation sank in like the frost creeping over their tent. Swift Runner's youngest children would die of starvation as they began subsisting on bark, roots, and eventually the dried moose hide that had been their tent. The prospect of survival became more bleak as the weeks passed. Nevertheless, the family continued on, bereaved but hopeful. Then, one day, Swift Runner's mother and brother went further into the wilderness, intent on hunting game, but they never came back. This further isolated Swift Runner and his remaining family. The never-ending chill deepened their misery, and the strange effects of hunger on the psyche intensified their suffering. As the days turned to nights, Swift Runner's thoughts became increasingly sinister, and he started having dreams about the Wendigo. Upon reaching the Oblate Mission in St. Albert in the spring of 1879, Swift Runner, who had been the sole survivor of his family to leave the forest, related to the priests the unfathomable horror of seeing his entire family devoured by starvation in the wilderness. Unsettling aspects remained unanswered as he described the catastrophe. Why had he survived alone? How could a man who had suffered such starvation look so well-nourished? These doubts persisted, but for the time being, the priest decided to trust Swift Runner and provide him with sanctuary and prayers. At the same time, the Wendigo's shadow was drawing nearer and nearer, and the truth was more sinister than anybody had ever imagined. As Swift Runner portrayed the distraught father, the priests to whom he recounted the story were troubled by troubling inconsistencies. Rumors circulated among other Cree hunters that the severity of starvation that winter in the Sturgeon River country was exaggerated. This created an atmosphere of quiet suspicion within the Oblate Mission. In addition, Swift Runner's healthy-looking, almost robust appearance was at odds with the picture of a man who had just survived a severe winter, and the mounted police began to suspect this, deciding to look into it further. Swift Runner first refused to budge from his statement, recounting a family engulfed in starvation. But when confronted with sharp inquiries, the experienced sergeant Richard Steele began to suspect something was amiss. After that, Swift Runner was taken into custody, apparently for reasons of general suspicion, and a police contingent was formed to return with him to his winter camp in order to collect evidence. A horse-drawn cart shackled Swift Runner, making the trip there long and difficult. At first, he led the party along the trail to Sturgeon River, but as time went on, it became obvious that he was purposely taking them in the opposite direction. The police were becoming more and more agitated and confused about what to do. At last, one of the Métis scouts, George Washington Brazeau, proposed an unusual strategy. One night, George steeped a strong mixture of tea in chewing tobacco, saying that this would be a medication to loosen Swift Runner's tongue. The following morning, after drinking the potion, Swift Runner's mood shifted dramatically. He became increasingly anxious as the potion took effect, and his defenses melted under the strain of questioning. Swift Runner, seemingly unable to continue being dishonest, reluctantly agreed to lead the party to his campsite. After further exploration of the wilderness, the group reached a clearing that, from a distance, appeared to be the site of a recently abandoned campsite. At this point, Swift Runner's story started to fall apart. Upon first discovery, the party found the moose hide that had been used to build the tent totally undamaged, not chopped into bits to be boiled for food as Swift Runner had claimed, draped over a couple of trees. As they drew nearer to the encampment, they beheld the horrific scene of Swift Runner's family's slaughter. 8 human heads, pieces of bone, and rags thrown about like rubble. The femurs and other lengthy bones had lost their marrow, and the skulls bore the distinctive scars of a sharp instrument. In the middle of the camp, further boiling bones lay among piles of ash, some of which still had fragments attached to them. Swift Runner's pretense crumbled in the face of this proof. He insisted on saying that he had eaten his family out of starvation, but his fit physique revealed the ugly reality. The camp appeared to have been overtaken by the Wendigo's shadow. The mounted police, who had never forgotten the horrific sights and sounds of the camp, reshackled Swift Runner and returned him to Fort Saskatchewan. The ride back was nerve-wracking because Swift Runner, now seen as a monstrosity, sat motionless in the cart, showing no signs of shame. Once at the fort, they led Swift Runner into a small interrogation room. They laid the bones on the table before him, forcing him to confront the evidence. At first, he continued to maintain a story of starving, repeating it in a level-headed manner. But as the questioning continued, he finally snapped. He identified the bones with icy casualness, picked one up, and then exclaimed, "This is my wife." Despite their unease, the detectives persisted in questioning him due to his apparent lack of emotion. Next, details of the terrible winter began to come to light. Swift Runner admitted that initially starvation had not been the driving force behind his crimes. Instead, he spoke of becoming sick in February 1879, his mind muddled by visions of the Wendigo. His dreams, he asserted, had become sinister and were replete with voices pushing him to murder. In his confession, he revealed that his family was still alive at that time, but he concealed the truth of their death from everyone. For days, he consumed the flesh while the others were unaware of anything beyond his death, as he recounted the tragic moment when madness and hunger consumed him. The sun was rising near the fire one morning when Swift Runner took his gun, shot his son, and then descended on him to complete the task. Swift Runner's insanity worsened over the weeks as he detailed instigating a new round of sibling attacks and then preparing their corpses. The youngest of the group met a more horrific end, the details of which will remain unknown here, as the rest of the family succumbed one by one to his insatiable hunger. Swift Runner's detailed confession horrified the investigators. When questioned about his atrocities, he blamed the Wendigo, claiming that the spirit had driven him to murder and eat his own family. However, the police did not believe him and continued to view the crimes as the product of a man's descent into depravity, so they did not exonerate him. At the conclusion of the interrogation, Swift Runner's guilt was beyond reasonable doubt. He was officially accused of killing his family, and his trial was scheduled to commence on August 16, 1879 in Fort Saskatchewan, marking the first murder trial in Western Canada's recorded history. On that day, the courtroom was filled to capacity with settlers, Cree observers, and Northwest Mounted Police, all of whom were anxious to see the proceedings because the case had attracted the region's undivided attention due to its ugliness. Swift Runner, when he took the stand, admitted to the murder of his wife and 5 children, but he maintained his story that his youngest son had starved to death, and that his mother and brother had vanished into the wilderness. The prosecution used the troubling indicators of deliberate crimes to demonstrate that Swift Runner's actions went beyond desperation and painted a picture of a man who embraced horror. Witnesses then testified about the evidence gathered at the camp. The defense attorney for Swift Runner tried to use the Wendigo legend to explain his client's behavior as a possession, but the colonial legal system rejected such claims as superstition, so the burden of proof was on the jury. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict, finding Swift Runner guilty. Swift Runner was eventually condemned to die on December 20th by the court, which had previously given a strong message to both the Cree and the settlers that, despite cultural differences, justice would be swift and uncompromising. In his alleged confession to Father Hippolyte Leduc, the oblate priest who cared for Swift Runner while he was in prison, the date was drawing near, and the details of his crimes were as follows. First, because they were unsuccessful hunters, Swift Runner and his family butchered and ate their dogs. Then, while his mother and brother went hunting, he remained behind with his wife and 5 children. After his mother and brother failed to return, Swift Runner's wife abducted 5 of their children to search for them. This left Swift Runner alone with his son, whom he confessed to having attacked and eaten in the days following their departure. As he meandered through the forest in the days that followed, Swift Runner encountered his wife and other children and informed them that the boy they had left behind had starved to death. Swift Runner went into an unprovoked rage, shot his wife, and attacked all but one of the children. With only one remaining, he and the child feasted on the carcasses of Charlotte and the others for over a week. The rest of the family then reluctantly accepted the news and went back to camp. Hunting became a real possibility as the weather warmed up, but Swift Runner continued to worry that the 7-year-old would reveal his father's crimes to the others at some point. So, instead of taking that chance, Swift Runner completed the task at hand and dealt with the boy in the same manner as the others. In a mixture of regret and resignation, the priest would later characterize these confessions as very disturbing. However, Swift Runner accepted his sentence with a stoic attitude, despite his assertions of Wendigo possession. The North Saskatchewan River lay frozen under a thick layer of snow near the prison yard on the cold morning of December 20th. The temperature hovered around -40 degrees, freezing everything except the fire around which a cluster of 60 Cree and Métis trappers huddled, along with the 20-man garrison of the fort, who had gathered to see Swift Runner's last moments. Standing on the scaffold alongside the condemned man, Father Leduc felt the chill of the frigid air intensify the gravity of the situation. Despite his shivers, perspiration beaded down his temples and back as a result of the stress of that day. Pulled the lever, and the trapdoor opened before a stunned audience. The execution of Swift Runner was the last act of a story that blurred the lines between myth and reality. Some saw him as a man pushed to the brink of insanity by his loneliness and hunger, while others saw him as the very incarnation of the Wendigo, a myth brought to life in the merciless Canadian North.